Welcome back to Junior ECTV. Abducted at age 5 from his school's soccer field, Michel Chikwanine was forced into war as a child soldier in the Democratic Republic of Congo. Now, 27 years old and an African studies student at the University of Toronto, Michel has co-authored a new graphic novel about his experiences called Child Soldier: When Boys and Girls Are Used in War. And he's now with us in studio to speak to us about his experience. Michel, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me.
So excited to have you. And this is a hard story to condense into a short few minutes, but I just wondered if you could share with us a little bit about your experience growing up and what happened.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
I grew up in the Democratic Republic of Congo on the eastern part of the country in a small town called Beni. And Beni growing up was just a normal, beautiful town. I had a very normal family. I had 3 sisters, my father who was a human rights activist and my mother who was an entrepreneur and a stay-at-home mom. But in the early 1990s in the Congo, with its history of economic strife and a lot of sort of colonial history that Congo went through. There's a dictator in power, and the dictator was always fighting with different people when it came to economic rights and all these other things. And my father, being a human rights activist, was always constantly fighting with the dictator. When I was 5 years old in the early 1990s, one of the conflicts that was going on between the government and the rebel group, I was playing soccer with my friends at a soccer field, and out of nowhere, a group of army trucks just came over, took all the kids who were in the soccer field. They took us to the rebel camp. And in the camp, I was manipulated. I was forced to kill my best friend as an initiation process into this army. And I was constantly put into this position where I was seeing death all around me as a way of trying to make me realize, be a killer, literally, is what they were trying to make me. Thankfully, after 2 weeks of being in this experience, somehow the fear of my father was much more than any fear that I had of being near these rebel soldiers, that I ended up running away after 2 weeks. And I ended up in a town called Butembo, which wasn't far away from Beni, where my family lived. And that's where I ended up getting reunited back with at my house.
Wow.
Unfortunately, my father, who was a human rights activist, like, as I said, was constantly fighting with people, whether it was trying to stop people from abducting children, whether it was fighting the government when they were infringing people's rights. This made my father a huge target. And so when I was 10 years old in 1998, my family had to flee my country in exile because of my father's work as an activist, and we ended up in Uganda, which is the country to the east of Congo. And we became refugees.
Wow.
And with that, when you're a refugee around the world, and I empathize with what's happening around the world right now, is I understood what that meant. As a refugee, we had no home, we had nothing. Literally, we didn't exist. And so my father and my mom were fighting to get us a refugee number, because without a refugee number, you don't exist.
You don't exist.
And so my family tried so hard to get us this number. Unfortunately, because of my father's work as an activist, he was eventually killed and assassinated. And at 12 years old, in 2001, my family and I tried so hard to get away, to try and be safe. Thankfully, the Canadian government at that time was the Liberal government. Paul Martin was in power as a Prime Minister, gave my family a one-way ticket to come over here on January 21st, 2004.
Wow.
And that's how I escaped. Literally, it's how I arrived here in Canada at 16.
Oh my goodness. I mean, just to hear all of that and take that in for all of us, I know is something that we can't imagine. But I thank you for being here, and we're so glad that you are here and safe. I want to ask you this question. When people hear the word child soldier, and I know you're coming out and you're speaking about this experience, but I feel like it's very easy for people to define you just by that. And I know that there's so much more to you and so much more to your cause. Can you tell us a little bit about why that experience, even though I'm sure is a huge part of you, does not define you?
Absolutely. I mean, the issue of child soldiers is just one of many experiences that I face. And the reason why I started telling this story wasn't for people to feel pity for me or to feel sorry for me. I really told this story because I feel the story, whether it's of a child soldier or a refugee, is connected to the largest story of struggle of so many people, whether it's homelessness here, whether it's Canadian soldiers coming back from Afghanistan and Iraq going through PTSD. There's this sort of huge connection between a lot of people's different struggles, and I think my story is much more than just a child soldier. It's more about how you overcome the struggles that you go through every single day.
Absolutely.
And that's what I want people to connect with. That's really the larger image of it. And then secondly, it's just to raise awareness about this issue, whether it's child soldiers, whether it's the plight of refugees, because I feel there's such a huge misrepresentation of who a child soldier is in the world.
Yes.
And especially we saw this through the conservative government that just lost power, was through Omar Carter, who was one of the prominent sort of story on the issue of child soldiers here in Canada, and the way they were trying to describe him as this child combatant, and they're using these tough words that really dehumanize this experience. And these are children, they're kids. They have no idea what's happening around the world. Most of the time, I have no idea. And so I wanted to bring a humanity to it. And I wanted my story to almost be a way of people understanding that this is a person.
Yes.
When you hear the number 250,000 child soldiers, they're not numbers. These are human beings, fundamentally human beings. And if I can stand up and I can tell my story, even though it's such a difficult story to tell, I tell it because I care.
Yes.
And I believe that everyone around the world, especially here in Canada, we have the responsibility and the ability to care for other human beings, whether it's child soldiers, whether it's homeless youth or homelessness in general, whether it's poverty, wherever it is around the world, we have that ability to care.
Yes.
And empathy is really something that I love about Canada, because it defines what this nation is. And I love that Prime Minister Trudeau really sort of embodies that and has tried to embody sort of that cause that what Canada has been to the world. And so that's really what I want to echo for a lot of young people, especially our youth. As we've been talking here, we're going to be in positions of power not so long from now.
Absolutely. And in fact, we may be there sooner than you think.
Exactly.
And I think that that's something really important.
Yeah.
You brought up Omar Carter. I know this was a case that was talked about, widely across this country, a case that was disputed by many people. How do you guys feel about the case of Omar Carter? And do you think that it was handled inappropriately by the Canadian government? Why was he questioned? He was clearly a child at the time of these incidents and crimes. Why was this a question?
I think Michel hit on the head when he said dehumanized, to the point where people start to think of them as just statistics. In the grand scheme of things, the Conservatives looked at Omar Carter and they looked at it as an opportunity for a precedent, or an opportunity to limit the amount of immigration or increase the safety of Canadians by weeding out terrorists and stuff, without actually thinking of the individual, of the strife, of the terror that the person went through. The concept that this person, he had out of his own volition, he decided, yes, I want to be a combatant against the world. I want to kill this person because I'm someone who wants to kill. It's beyond a fallacy. It's disgusting, really. And I support anyone who fights against, just having these governments sometimes look and think this is just a pawn, this is something I can push my agenda. Myself, I'm not a proponent of the Green Party yet. When Elizabeth May, even in her drunken stupor, when she did mention, F the Parliament, F Harper, Omar Carter, he is a hero, I do share her sentiments in that sense, in which they're not just people, they're children. They're children who've been ripped from their conditions. And sometimes we think about, it's not like child soldiers are something that we don't know about. Everyone is aware, but no one takes the time to really think about the concept of, imagine instead of going to high school or instead of going to grade school, I can hardly remember what I did when I was 10 years old, let alone remember these terrible things. They don't have an ideology, they're just being molded.
Do you think we can understand these issues in coming from the privilege that we come from in living in a country like Canada, being in the West, do you think we can actually understand what people are going through around the world and some of the conflict that's happening around the world? Do you think it's even possible for us?
I think it depends on your interpretation of what it means to understand something. Can we personally fully know exactly what something like that would feel like? Of course not. We've never experienced anything like that at all. But can we empathize? Absolutely. And it's first-person narratives like what Michel gives us that makes all the difference. And the more we learn, the more we trigger that natural human compassion. So we can't understand what it would feel like to be ourselves in that situation. We've never known anything even a little bit like that. But that doesn't give us an excuse not to care, because we can relate. We can think, what if it was my sister? What if it was my my own child? What if it was me? We can think in that way, and we have to.
Or even if you can't relate, at least sympathize, at least try to look.
You know, but I don't think it's that hard to sit there and think that someone like Michel could have been my brother, could have been my sister, my best friend, you know? So I think from that point of view, it's easy to sit there, and obviously we're not going to understand fully. I don't want to degrade anything that you've ever said, saying that, oh, I just understand it. Obviously we're not, but we certainly have an obligation to try and an obligation to help these people. So I don't understand why the Conservative government handled Omar's case so badly when we're just, we're human beings and we have an obligation to help each other, because we live in a better society than, not a better society, but a society that's more capable of helping people.
Can I just chime in quickly?
Yes.
And I completely agree with all of you, but I think if you really look for a unifying effect in what all of this what causes all of this, is the fact that people try and boil it down too much. Like, in general, there's just this effort to try, because these are such complex issues, like ethnic, socio-economic conflicts that go back thousands of years, they try and simplify it. And in the same way, they sort of simplify things politically. Like, conservative voters tend to think, well, this is what we stand for. We're the anti-immigration party. When really, like, the Conservative Party, the conservative voter base is all about opportunity without interference from government. It's all about the ability to climb the ladder yourself. It's about being compassionate. And yet, like, there is no greater government, like, forget about high taxes, there's no greater governmental interference than when you have a government that is hostile to its own citizens, like you have in Syria. You have army groups recruiting children to fight wars in conflicts all around the world, like the one that you were in, Michel. Like, I just think that it's too easy, and it's not right to boil it down to this equals this and that equals that.
That's a fair point. We're going to move on from that point because there's so much more I want to discuss. I want to talk about the Syrian refugee crisis, and I want to talk about 3-year-old Alan Kurdi and the photo that came up of his lifeless body on the beaches, and why did that create why was that photo the one thing that created such a ripple effect across the globe, even though there's been so many children just like him that have lost their lives trying to, seek asylum? Why was that one photo the straw that sort of broke the camel's back, if you would say, and then why was it forgotten so quickly? And I want to get your opinion and all of your opinion.
Well, I think, first of all, and we talked about this, you guys were talking about this a little, of social media and sort of the disconnection that it has to humanity. And I think that's what that image did, was because it was a child, it was a human being. And I think fundamentally for every human being, whether you're a horrible human being, when you see a child, you see innocence.
Yes.
And that the image itself showed innocence and the loss of innocence of a child without ideology, without anything, just looking for an opportunity to be recognized as a human being, and died. And I think that's really what stirred up that emotion. But the problem with social media, and this is the other problem, is that there's a lack of responsibility. And we saw this, just drawing again to the issue of child soldiers, we saw this with the Kony 2012 sort of movement itself, is there's a lack of accountability. You can click on something, but unless it's something that you're passionate about, that you truly, truly care about and understand, you're not going to care about it. You're just going to go and move away quickly, especially in this era where we're living on clickbait. Really, you're just clicking on something for 10 seconds and then we move on. And the issue of child soldiers, whether it's politics, and I think Christian really brought up a great point of understanding historical context.
Yes.
And I think a lot of time when we discuss, whether it's politics, whether we're discussing an issue, we lack the historical context to it, and we just live off headlines.
Right.
Which is why that story disappeared so quickly, because it wasn't steeped in historical context to understand why Syrians are fleeing.
Right.
They're not fleeing because they hate their country or they somehow want to have a better future in Canada. They had their homes.
Right.
And part of what happened in Syria is that Syria was a country that was very multicultural. And whether it's right, our intervention was right or not, we went and intervened because we wanted to go bring democracy to these countries. What does democracy look like now?
Right.
I could, again, bring that back to Libya. Very similar thing that happened in Libya, where these countries were functioning. They weren't perfect, obviously not.
Right.
However, we went to fight in these countries. We destroyed the very structures that were already there, and now the people are fleeing. They're looking for a way out. Like, we went and bombed their homes, whether that was for the right reason or not. Again, the point here being that there's a historical narrative that sometimes lacks when we talk about when we talk about some of the issues. Yeah.
I think part of the reason, and I'll talk about the reason it became successful and why it went away, the reason it became successful is that it's something we can all agree on. When we see a child, and I think there's so much demonization of what a refugee is, these are terrorists trying to get into our country.
Yeah.
We see a child, that is not a terrorist, that is not a political enemy of the state, that's a kid. That's someone's kid, that could be my kid,
Yeah.
that's someone's kid, and that kid is dead.
Yeah.
And that's something that triggers something absolutely universal, which is that sympathy and that compassion. Now, I think the reason it went away so quickly is because what comes from that after is not universal, because it's what do we do? And there's no easy answer. There's no objective, correct, pathway that we have to go down. So it comes in because we all agree that's awful, but
Right.
it goes away so quickly because we can't agree on what to do.
Okay, that's an interesting point.
One of the big criticisms, one of my biggest criticisms of the news cycle is that it's a cycle, it's cyclical, and something gets its time in the spotlight and then it goes away. When
Right.
it doesn't necessarily mean that it's gone. Like Darfur is still a war-torn region. Syria, obviously, ISIS is still murdering like hundreds of thousands of people in Iraq and Syria again. You have this European migrant crisis. You have conflicts all over the world, but they don't get arguably they don't get the press they deserve due to scale, just because the news is cyclical and people want, think about the word news. People want new stuff.
They want something
They
fresh.
don't want it's not necessarily the stuff that's still there or the stuff that's the most important. I'm not saying it's not, but people want new information, and that doesn't necessarily mean the most pressing information. I think that's what.
How do we get
Start the momentum.
around that issue, though, and how do we inspire people your age to see things through a little bit more and to also think critically? And I know that you've been saying that education is such an important key to the solution, and critical thinking, and knowing that just that news headline isn't always just that's not just all it is, so you can blanket, a whole continent like Africa, and you can say, I think I understand what's going on here, when you really don't, and you don't understand. It's these stereotypes.
I think one big way to do it is I'm in a world issues course. So it's a 12th grade course, university course, and what it does essentially is each unit is, the curriculum changes just all the time, and each unit is about a specific event. So for example, for the past 3-ish months, we've just been doing Syria. But the year before, they spent, I think, a while on ISIS. The years before that, they talk about droughts in specific countries or such. They talked about specific situations. And I think something that's important is depth. Because you see things on the surface, but I mean, the Democratic Republic of Congo, this is warfare that's been going on for beyond years, decades. This is something that's occurred for so long, and you won't see a headline for the DPRK, Democratic Republic of Congo, just because there are so many things that have happened in between then. If we could have just one in-depth look, there are so many documentaries and such, that's a really huge one. I remember I saw one on, I think, BBC, Al Jazeera, stuff like that. They go so in-depth to the situation, and they do inspire to do something. But then, like they said, the issue is, what do you do? Right now, I feel like I have consumed this information. I feel like I know a lot. I feel for Michel. I feel for everyone. Yet even myself, someone who wants to say he's astute, I have no idea, what do I do from this point?
What do young people do?
Well, just to touch upon some of the point that you brought up, I think what you brought up fundamentally there is this lack within our own education system to connect what's truly happening to the world with the reality of knowledge building. Education is supposed to be this place where young people feel connected to the world, what's going on around. And now we're seeing that disconnection is, yes, we're teaching students math, science, arithmetic, and all these things, which of course are extremely important to the fundamental building of a human being, especially at our age. But there's a lack of connection of reality of what's happening around the world. So when we do go to school and we do study math and science, we're sitting there asking ourselves, well, how is this applicable to what's happening in the world today? I'm so happy to hear that there's courses like, World Issues course that connects sort of those stories, and it shows that young people want to be connected to that.
I hate to cut you off, but we're going to be right back after the break, and I think that there's much more to discuss on the issue, so we'll be right back. Stay with us.